All right. Hello and welcome back. My name is Joshua Jones. Welcome back, whether you're listening through podcast or watching our YouTube channel. Otherwise, please like and subscribe. Today, we have an interesting conversation. And I'm really looking forward to this because in some ways, it's not an issue I've given a tremendous amount of thought to with everything concerning lockdown and social restrictions. The whole idea of wearing a mask or being kind of forced by the government to wear a mask, whether you want to or not, it's not an issue I've considered. I've considered social distancing, having people in your home, singing in church, whether the government can tell churches not to meet. There's a lot of ways we've reflected either on the podcast or here on YouTube about these issues. But only recently am I really trying to stop and think about the whole mask issue. I feel I've been pretty flexible on this point, kind of up till now. Kevin, our guest today, he has given it a lot more thought than I have. I look forward to hearing what he has to say. Now, Kevin, he is from Keighley, up in the north of England, up in Yorkshire. He, until fairly recently, has been an elder in his church, been part of a church plant, so been involved in church leadership in different ways. He is a professional translator. We actually have something in common. We both lived in France, and actually for a while, when I lived in France, I was actually studied to be a translator as well from France to English. So we actually were both in France around similar times, taking similar courses in French universities. So that was kind of a fun piece of commonality to discover there. Kevin, welcome. It is really great to have you as part of a conversation about the subject of masks and how it might intersect or not with Christian beliefs. So anything else I need to add to this introduction?
No, there's nothing else that you need to add. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Super. So, we've covered a lot here on the YouTube channel and the podcast about Christ and Caesar and what is the authority of Christ over his people and Caesar, and when does the limits of Caesar's authority end, and what is appropriate for government to ask of the church and what is not. Where does the Bible draw these lines? I admit, Kevin, I have not given a whole lot of thought to the issue of masks, and I say that as a pastor. Probably about 90% of our people wear masks. We have a few who show up without masks. But whereas we've given a lot of thought to singing and a lot of thought to gathering and having people in homes and whether we hug or not in church, we haven't really given a lot of thought to this whole issue of masks. So could you maybe unpack why you feel this is an important issue for the church at this time?
I think for me it's an important issue because, and for the whole sort of situation, it seems to me to be a truth and justice issue that we're battling with. I think that the church, according to 1 Timothy, is supposed to be a pillar and buttress for the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that truth is just limited to gospel truth, but it is obviously mainly for that. And I think that we need to stand up for the truth. And so for me, with the mask issue, I just monitored the trajectory of how the media and the government were going, kind of like this time last year, April, May last year, when everyone was basically saying no, masks are ineffective. But then there was this push that seemed to be from the media and from certain areas of society that were basically saying that we need to be wearing masks and we need to follow everyone else who's wearing them, even though the science at the time, and certainly since, I don't think it's been refuted, was saying that the evidence for their effectiveness is weak, and so that was kind of really where my objections were. Really, we were going to be told that it was going to become, well, it was, first of all, it would become mandatory on the trains and on public transport, and then in shops. And I seem to remember on the Monday, I think on the Sunday, Michael Gove was asked whether or not masks would become mandatory in shops, and he said no. And then on the Tuesday they were, and I don't recall Matt Hancock actually giving any scientific basis for it. It was more for increasing people's confidence to shop and to go out side
Mm-hmm.
and sort of start doing regular things. But I think what it did was kind of polarize society between those who wear masks
Yeah.
and those who won't. And I think
Yeah.
that polarization has also come into the church, and the kind of rhetoric from the kind of secular world has come in with this whole, um, I'm not doing it for me, I'm not wearing the mask for me, I'm wearing a mask for you. And then that's been transferred into wearing a mask is loving your neighbour, and,
Yeah.
and all this sort of thing.
Yeah. We
And
hear
so if you
that
don't,
sort of reasoning a lot. Yeah.
yeah, and so even evangelical leaders have sort of said, it's not loving to not wear a mask in the congregation in church and stuff
Mm.
like that. And so I think once we get into this sort of language, which is kind of importing what the kind of mainstream narrative and what the media is saying into church, rather than stepping back and thinking, hang on a minute, why is this happening, and what are the ramifications of this?
Yeah.
I just find that troubling.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned this. For most of this time, I haven't had much of a problem wearing a mask because it doesn't discomfort me. I mean, I had to shop around a bit and find one that was comfortable that I could breathe in, and it took a while, but I finally did find one. I was like, oh, okay, I think I can manage this. It didn't seem like a big inconvenience to me. However, I do remember at the time just some of the strangeness around it in regards to, you're bringing up the subject of truth. I still remember, whether it was Chris Whitty or Matt Hancock, these guys that they kind of wheel out to give the speeches at the beginning. They said, no, you won't have to wear masks. All the studies show that they really don't make that much of a difference anyway. And then a week later, it's like, all right, everyone wear a mask. And you were hoping, for that sort of a U-turn, such a drastic, sudden U-turn on public policy, that they would have wheeled out solid studies and evidences and proof. And the government never really delivered on that. Like you
No.
say, maybe it would make people feel safer. But to go from, masks have been around a long time, 20, 30, like, I don't know, but decades. There's been plenty of time for studies on this. And to go from saying no one has to wear masks, the studies show they really don't make any difference, to so suddenly showing they do, in spite of the fact that certain organizations, the HWO and others, were saying they don't make much of a difference. 1 week, as you said, the day they were saying only in crowded public areas like public buses or undergrounds. And then the next day, you kind of have to wear them everywhere. And now kids who have as much chance of dying of COVID as being struck by lightning have to wear them in school. And it's not that it's a huge inconvenience. I don't particularly mind wearing my mask. It doesn't discomfort me. But there just seems to be more going on behind the scene. And, okay, you don't want to be a conspiracy theorist. But you are just curious as a person, why the sudden change in policy with seemingly little to no explanation?
I think it was a political decision, and it was a political decision to provide kind of like a placebo effect, really, to give people the impression that they're actually doing something personally to combat the virus. So I wear my mask, I'm protecting others, I'm actually doing something, rather than passively just sort of sitting at home, like we've been told, or to do the other sorts of things. And I think, like you mentioned WHO, but they did a U-turn. They weren't recommending wearing masks, and then they did a U-turn. Our government's own pandemic planning preparedness says that masks are. It doesn't put them in as a mitigation policy. Even Jenny Harries, I think Deputy Chief Medical Officer, said that they can even increase your risk of transmission. And so when I was reading all this and seeing all this in the run up to it, I'm thinking, well, I'm not going to wear. I'm not going to be emotionally manipulated into wearing something that I don't think I need to wear. That there's, and like you say, that there hasn't been strong scientific support for their effectiveness. I think if there was, like there's often this comparison is made between wearing a mask and a seatbelt. Well, the fact of the matter is that the seatbelts underwent empirical testing for their effectiveness.
Yeah.
Masks haven't. I mean, there was I think there's a Danish randomized control trial test that took place back end of last year, or was published back end of last year. It had struggled being published because I think the results of it weren't what people wanted to hear, and I think that the effectiveness between those who wore masks and those who didn't wear a mask, it was kind of 0.3% in favour of those who wore masks. So we're
Yeah.
talking about a negligible effect. And when you look at the trajectory of the
Yeah.
cases and everything, mask mandates haven't made any difference
Yeah. There was
whatsoever.
there was a similar study that I think it came out about a month ago, where they followed 5,000 Marines, 5,000 Marines not wearing a mask versus 5,000 Marines wearing a mask, and just monitored them over the course of 5-6 months during this pandemic. And it was the same thing. You would think that among all those Marines who were working together in close quarters, often going out for drinks and food and things, if they're not wearing masks there, it's going to spread real quickly among them. But it was the same thing. It was almost identical. I think there was actually a slight in favor of those who wore the mask, had a very tiny, almost negligible increase. And I think like one extra person perhaps had come down with COVID. But let's push back. Let me just push back a little bit on this and say, okay, it doesn't really make a difference. Sure, masks, maybe when all is said and done, it doesn't really protect us from COVID, but is it that big of an ask? Are we actually losing anything? Maybe it doesn't help, but does making us wear a mask, particularly, we're talking about church, does having to wear masks in church make us lose anything?
I think in a way it does. Yeah, some would argue that it's covering up the image of God. We're made in God's image. Some would say if you're covering up your face, then you're made in the image of God. I think the other thing is if we know that basically it's a political decision, and that we know that it impedes normal interaction between human beings, and we are relational, and we express so much through our facial expressions, without even saying words sometimes. And that interaction that we have in church with one another, the whole social distancing, being in bubbles, and that's one thing, but not actually being able to see someone's face as well. For me personally, I find that very, very difficult to actually engage with someone if they're just wearing a mask. And I think, from a spiritual level, when, we know from Ephesians that we're battling against rulers and principalities in the air and stuff, I think we know that we're in a spiritual battle, and I think we owe it to ourselves and to the members of our churches really to see whether or not this is a policy that we want to be following, because it effectively dehumanizes people by covering up their faces. And I think, for me, having, the few times that I've actually attended sort of church with people wearing face masks, I found it quite oppressive looking around and seeing, the people I love wearing these masks, which I think are pointless, and at the same time not being able to sing. And I sit there and I think, well, who is behind not wanting us to sing and in church ultimately? And I think it's a spiritual battle that we're facing.
So my own journey on masks, as I said at the beginning, it's not on one hand, it's not something I've given much thought to. In our church, we sing and have really always sung throughout the course of this pandemic, but we've sung with masks on, at least those of us who, like I said, 90% of our people wear masks. There's a handful that don't. But, sure, I can sing. I got an easy fitting mask. It's easy for me to sing with my mask on. However, as you say, this is an interesting theological question. What does the Bible say about the human face? And in what way does the human face reflect and display the image of God or the glory of God? Like that's a big question. That's worth unpacking a little bit. And I think it's probably beyond the scope of our short time together to
Yeah.
fully get into that. But, you think of some verses, God bless us, let the light of your face shine upon us, and the glory of God shining through the face of Moses. And, the many verses, both in the Old and New Testament, talking about the face,
Yeah.
It would be an interesting discussion around that. I know for both myself as the preacher pastor at our church, as well as the worship team, one of the things that I've noticed that I thought was just personal until I heard it from some of the worship leaders, the people in the band as well. They say it's a bit harder to lead because we're used to looking out at the congregation and seeing smiles and people kind of, these facial expressions of people really worshiping the Lord and praising the Lord. Certainly as a preacher, because I don't rely much on notes, I kind of just engage with the people in a more conversational style. I'm used to seeing faces, whether they understand and are with me or whether they're not. And maybe I've made a difficult point, I have to explain myself. I'm really used to reading faces in the room for how I preach. And with everyone masked up, I found that lack of visual feedback a lot harder. So I do relate that there's practical challenges in terms of fellowship, people fellowshipping with one another, not able to see smiles, not able to read, so much emotion gets communicated through expressions in the face. And I see why you would say that, that the social dynamic we're called to as the body of Christ is limited by the wearing of masks. I think there's a fair point to be made there.
I think the other thing is that I believe that the government's overstepped the mark on many areas since this whole thing started. I mean, the big red flag for me was when they made it illegal for churches to meet. I'm still shocked and baffled by that. But I think, the government's overreached in the extent that it's mandated that churches open or close. It's overreached in terms of how they interact with one another, how they speak, how they sing. Whether or not they can perform baptism and communion, how baptism and communion are performed. And now, it's got to the extent that they're actually overreaching into what people actually wear when they meet to worship God. All in the name of health and safety. But, the writer Camus said that the welfare of the people is the alibi of tyrants. And so we need to be aware of this kind of thing. And
the welfare of people is the alibi of tyrants.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's all, I'm doing this for your good. It's the right thing to do. All this kind of thing. It's happened before in history, and it's opened the way to many terrible things. And I think we just need to be. It's not suggesting that this is doing that, but we do still need to be aware and just discern a little bit.
Yeah. So you'd see there's a lack of vigilance, perhaps, among Christians.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that one of the things that I've always struggled with, even before I became a Christian, was how kind of gullible and naive I thought a lot of Christians could be.
Yeah.
And I think one of the gifts is the gift of discernment. I think we need to be able to discern the times. And I think this might be an area where I think the thing is for me is when do we say enough is enough? When do we say that you've kind of got no jurisdiction here? And so it's difficult, I think, for me personally, sort of sharing the gospel. If I was sharing the gospel with someone wearing a mask, because I'd be wearing a mask and thinking I'm kind of like complicit in this kind of deception, really.
So the Bible speaks about bearing false witness, and certainly, you got to raise the question. Okay, if you had some studies, and let me just pose this question to our listeners, regardless of what side of the debate you're on, whether you're a mask wearer or not, and whether you think it's reasonable to wear masks in church or not, let's say, I know throughout the course of this conversation, we've cited a couple studies that we've come across, but what if you came across a couple studies of your own that you found to be reliable? And according to the studies, there was a tiny percent chance that actually by wearing masks are more dangerous than not wearing masks. Let's say you came across this and you believe, but you looked into it, you believe it was actually a reliable study instead of just one of these fake fluff studies, that sometimes people could do. Let's say you came across this. Now, how would you respond to that? Because right now in society, the visible thing, the thing we're getting from the government and the media and the pressure is that, if you love your neighbor, you'll wear this mask. And so people are wearing the mask. But if you had evidence that actually wearing a mask doesn't practically love your neighbor, in fact, there may be a tiny chance that it could put your neighbor at just a little more risk, would you take the mask off? Or is it not so much a desire to love your neighbor, but as to be seen to be loving your neighbor? Because there's a big difference in motivation between wanting to be seen to be loving your neighbor and going along with the narrative where everyone can celebrate how much they love their neighbor and actually do it in reality.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very good question to ask, and it'd be interesting to see what your viewers respond to.
One of the things, the way I've changed my mind is I remember just a few months ago talking with a pastor, and we were talking about the restrictions we were putting in our place, the health and safety things for our church. And he said, we actually allow a lot of freedom, but we do ask our people to wear a mask. And I said the same thing. And I said, yeah, we're probably much more on the free socializing, meeting side of things. But, I said at the time, it's just a piece of cloth. I remember those words coming out of my mouth. It's just a piece of cloth, and it doesn't stop us from singing, and we're still meeting. Why get all worked up over a piece of cloth? And then I remember, I think one of the things that got me thinking more about this was a couple months later reading something in America, concerning these, some of the riots that have taken place. And they were comparing and contrasting the Black Lives Matter symbol along with the Confederate flag from the Confederate States during the Civil War, the big orange flag. And I remember I forget which side, whether it was the Confederate side or the Black Lives Matter side, but I remember one of them being quoted saying, "You don't need to make this illegal. It's just a piece of cloth." And it kind of took me back in my mind to saying, oh yeah, sometimes a piece of cloth can have a lot of socio-political connotations to it and have a symbolic value much greater than just being a piece of cloth.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think that the whole love kind of question, it's a loving thing to do to wear a mask. I think this it works both ways. I think
Yeah.
The loving thing to do for me, and what I've been saying all along, is the loving thing to do is to tell the truth. And I think the loving thing to do in terms of COVID is to say that, yeah, there's a genuine threat, but the threat is by no means as great as we've been told, and we do not need to be as scared as we have been,
Yeah.
and we do not need all the fear propaganda, and we don't need a constant reminder, a visual reminder on our faces that we are in the midst of some, this great pandemic that, by breathing on someone else you could effectively kill them, and actually making you the person. It's the same with the whole asymptomatic transmission thing.
Mm-hmm.
Be treated like you're a virus carrying killer.
Treating healthy people as if they were sick.
Yeah, this whole thing, quarantining the healthy, is completely upside down. It goes against biblical principles.
Yeah, the Bible does speak about quarantining.
Yeah, but it says it quarantines the sick person. The leper goes to the Levitical priest, and the Levitical priest tells them to isolate for 7 days, or however long it is. The Levitical priest doesn't isolate. They do not self-isolate when they've come into contact with a leper.
Yeah.
And I think love is outworked in the truth. What's the most loving thing for us to do as Christians? Is to share the gospel, and it's outworked in our love for humans. And if we're going along with something that's dehumanizing them, I have to ask, how how is that loving? You know,
Yeah.
isn't it lessening the individual? I think one brother on the Fellowship of Biblical Christians sort of said that they're a serious assault on the interrelationships that God has ordained between people.
A
And I would
serious
have to agree.
assault on the
Interrelationships that God has ordained between people.
Okay.
Um, you know, and I think as Christians, we've got a biblical warrant to fight injustice. God loves justice.
Hmm.
And I think it's unjust to put this on people, especially sort of leaving the church question aside, but especially what they've done with children in schools.
That's a
It's
mess.
horrendous.
Yeah. Um, yeah. I likewise, even in my more mask wearing days, and to be honest, it's probably been 3-4 months since I've rarely worn a mask in the last 3 months. Even in stores, I tend not to wear a mask unless the owner comes and specifically asks me to wear a mask, in which case I'll either put it on out of respect for the owner, or I'll leave the shop and go to another shop. Then it's my choice. But both within church and in shops, I try to wear one. I try to be polite about it too. If someone approaches me and talks to me, I try not to be shrill. I try to be kind. And when I meet somebody else who's not wearing a mask, I compliment them on their smile. Hey, nice smile. I try to be friendly and joking. I think the stereotype is people who are not going along with all the lockdown stuff is that they're shrill, or they're anti-vaxxers, or they're all anarchists, and they all want the government to burn, and everyone, they're ultra hyper libertarians, everyone do their own thing, sort of. That's kind of the image the media portrays. Violent anti-vaxxers, anti-government forces, these sorts of things you see in the media. But to what you were saying, I even in these days when I was wearing the mask, I was never really caught up in the whole, well, if you love your neighbor, you'll wear a mask. To me, that didn't make sense, because that works both ways. I could, yes, you can be selfish and be a pro-masker, and you can be selfish and be an anti-masker. Like, you could be on either side of this debate and be motivated by selfish reasons, or you could be on either side of this debate and be motivated by unselfish reasons. You could say, hey, because I think without a mask, I'm making you sick, so I'm going to wear a mask to help ensure your safety. Yeah, that's a selfless thing. Certainly if it's true, it's a selfless thing. But it works the other way. It could be saying, I want all your churches to wear a mask and all your shops to wear masks so that I can be slightly safer. You could be
Yeah,
insisting on all of society to wear these masks that have a negligible risk effect just so I can feel safer. The accusation of selfishness could go both ways just
yeah, and
as
I think
easily.
the same can be said for all of these impositions, really, that they've affected the whole of society,
Yeah.
when in fact we needed to protect and shelter the vulnerable and the most at risk, and the rest of us could go about pretty much our daily business. In fact, the government's own pandemic planning, coming back to that, says that we want to keep things as normal. I'm loosely paraphrasing, for the sake of the morale of the country. Okay, not this constant fear mongering. And let me just give you an example of the so we were saying about the selfless and the selfish sort of nature of this. I went into Sainsbury's on I think it was the 23rd of July last year. The day before, I think it was, the mask mandate came in. I went in, no one wearing masks, one or two maybe. I went in the following day just to see whether or not everyone was going to adopt this, and I was pretty much the only person not wearing a mask.
Wow.
And so from that one day to the next, everyone's started wearing these masks. So you can't tell me that it was for selfless reasons that they were wearing it, because
Yeah.
if it was, then they would have been wearing it the day before,
Yeah.
or in the run up to it, or in March and April last year, when infections and that were at the highest and stuff like that. So it's just simply not true.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people, to be fair, are going along with it and they don't want to wear them.
Yeah.
But they kind of have to for work or whatever reason, or because
Yeah.
it's easier to do it than rather than sort of
Yeah.
confront it. I mean, I've been confronted for not wearing one, and but I think we need to kind of demolish that whole thing. Like, oh, I'm wearing a mask, I'm protecting us. And again, this is something you might be able to help me with this. I've never quite got my head around it. I'm not wearing this to protect me. I'm wearing it to protect you. But if the other person is then wearing a mask and it's not protecting them, it's protecting you. How do they work? Does the virus just go one way, or I can't quite get my head around it. I've never been able to figure it out.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, I've heard things. I've heard what other people explain it. But like you said, it's one thing for a guy to get behind a microphone and say, "This is to protect grandma, wear a mask,"
hmm,
and then to actually produce studies, real studies from the real world, not projection
hmm,
models, but like real studies that demonstrate these things. Um, and there is a sort of a reverse thing. Well, you want to say, and the way I'd like as a pastor to be able to say is, you are welcome to our church, whether you are a mask person or not a mask person. We welcome everyone in our church. So if you want to show up with a mask, if that makes you feel safer, if carrying your own bottle of hand sanitizer and using it 20 times during the course of the service, if that makes you feel safer and you believe that's helping you and maybe helping others, great, do that. We will not turn anyone away for wearing a mask. But likewise, should churches turn people away for not wearing a mask?
hmm.
Unless you have an overwhelming mountain of scientific evidence that that person will kill people in your congregation by showing up in a mask. And you are turning someone away who's made in the image of God. And the Bible says a lot about, turning people away. It's usually the word inclusive is often misused in church circles,
Yeah.
to often be inclusive of sometimes godless ideas, but we're talking about actually welcoming, being hospitable to people, whatever their, whether they're masked or not, whether they've had the vaccine or not.
Yeah.
And, to put a sign out, say, no non-maskers welcome here. Like, wow. But
I
is
mean,
that,
yeah, it's the same thing. If you've got someone who's saying, those who refuse to wear masks are failing to love their brothers and sisters in the congregation,
yeah,
um, where does that end? What about? So if you think that they're posing a health risk by not wearing a mask,
mhm,
what if they haven't been vaccinated? Or what if someone comes in, you don't know whether or not they've been vaccinated or whatever? Well,
yeah,
you're going to start asking for their vaccination, their medical history,
yeah,
for other illnesses even, uh, and so there's some strange things that happen when I attended church. People would be sitting down wearing a mask, but then they would go up and maybe do a reading
yeah,
from the front, and they take the mask off, but they speak into a microphone that is then shared with other people,
mhm,
which isn't, I don't know, to the best of my knowledge, not sanitised in between each. So,
mhm.
and yet we're told that it transmits on surfaces. I just don't understand. If you're sitting down and we're not wearing a mask, and we're wearing a mask, and you walk 2 meters, 3 meters away to the
Yeah,
front, it just the whole situation just seems absurd to me. So I just think, well,
yeah,
why on earth would I go along with it?
yeah. Yeah.
Um,
The New Testament, I think, speaks a lot about, constraining people's consciences. My concern is not so much whether someone wears a mask or not, but that either the government or even church leadership constrains the consciences of their people. Like, sure, we can make masks available. We can suggest that maybe they'll help. I mean, it may depend what study you look at, whether you believe that or not. But that's
mm,
almost beside the point. Like, if you really believe you're helping someone by wearing a mask, then far be it from us as church leaders to command you not to wear a mask. Like, God forbid. If you believe that's right before God, then by all means wear a mask. But likewise, if people believe it's better for themselves and for others to be able to see your face, to smile, to express as you were kind of saying, the image of God in different ways for fellowship and New Testament, one another purposes, then you shouldn't have to wear a mask. That's between you and God. It's Christ's body. He owns your body, and one day you're going to give an account to him. And for the government or even church leaders and pastors like myself to kind of issue these commands, this is what you have to wear or not wear, on the basis of such flimsy evidence, to me seems like we're intruding upon a personal and holy domain that belongs just between the individual and God.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think that's part of the problem that we're facing as a nation. Obviously, not isolated as a nation, but things being made mandatory when they could have been voluntary.
Yeah.
I think if we look back at the start of this whole crisis, I call it a lockdown crisis rather than the pandemic or the COVID crisis, because I think the damage is greater. But I think at the very start, before any of this stuff was made legal or illegal, people were exercising their common sense in the main, and they were, practically doing things and implementing things that would kind of mitigate risk. We didn't need to be infantilized and told exactly what to do, told how we can hug or we shouldn't hug, or these kinds of things. And I think if people were just given advice, they would have followed that advice. And I think the same is applicable to mandatory face coverings.
Yes. Well, Kevin, thank you very much for being on the show. It is you've been asking and raising some really great questions about things that until recently I haven't given that much thought to. So I appreciate you. You seem like a very reflective guy. You've considered these things, and I think it would do well. I think for a lot of us Christians, we just haven't given that much thought to it, and I think maybe a lot of our listeners, a lot of people watching on YouTube, they've obviously thought about the lockdown and whether churches meet or not, or sing or not, but maybe masks isn't something they've given that much theological reflection to. And I know we kind of mentioned it without really getting into the scriptures so much, but even the whole idea of face and the importance of human faces to reflect something of God's image. That's, we didn't really get into that here. We brought it up, but certainly a good thing that I would encourage our people to go out and open their Bibles. And as always, we encourage people to open their Bibles and really begin to hear from God for themselves on these things, and pray for the gift of discernment. So, but Kevin, thank you for coming on. If you've watched this, we do interviews like this from time to time on these sorts of subjects. Please like and subscribe. If you're subscribed to our podcast, if you'd like more of this. God bless you, Kevin, and your family up there in Yorkshire. And I just pray that between you and your church, that you would find a healthy way forward, and very soon be able to find being a community where you can freely worship again and fellowship again.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.